This is equality. We see this in American politics as well. Both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party argue that their policies are more conformant with freedom and equality, and that's what they're jostling back and forth on, but they have completely different policies in certain areas. So how can it both be the case that one is that they're both conformant with freedom and equality? So what Stephen Smith says is that these are actually vacuous terms. The point that you're making about happiness is that, well, if people are able to decide, like this is what you kept saying, we decided as a society, why should we suppose that humans can arrive at a rational conclusion? Human beings in groups are very irrational, actually. They act irrationally, and they're very easily manipulated, right? Human beings are easily manipulated by government forces or by media. So this appeal to we collectively decide or we figure it out, I mean, this is very irrational, I would say, and it doesn't actually make sense. If we want to talk about happiness, there's an objective answer to that, and I've cited all of the research that tells you what human happiness actually entails.
Do you believe that slavery is an ideal system? Do you believe that that there should be slaves in a society?
Well, we're getting off the topic. We can talk about slavery.
No, this is part of the conversation. Do you think slavery is okay?
Yeah. I mean, slavery is something that I do not find to be immoral. And I can give you an argument for that, but if you interrupt me, then there's no point.
I just don't want you to go into... I mean, you could lengthily... The thing is, you could go lengthily into citing one or two sources that argue why slavery is good or why slavery is okay.
You're interested in truth, right? So I try to give evidence-based arguments. So if you're interested in that, I'll provide. I'll try to be as brief as possible. I understand the time constraint.
The thing is, down seriously, I don't want to fight you. I don't want this to turn into a fight. I really
then let me finish.
In good faith. I could have lengthily prepared many sources and gone into what this source says, this source says that. If we had engaged in such a conversation, we would have a 5-hour talk, and we are already at 3 hours.
I'll give a very short. You asked me the question. You bring it up, right? So if you bring it up, what do you want? You just want me to say yes, so I look like a barbarian, and then you cut me off?
No. I really just want to have brief, logical discussions on the concept of slavery, for example. I don't want to go into lengthy papers. We can gladly look. If you want to have a debate with me, I would love to have a debate on issues. If you would like to have a debate, if people want to see that, if you think that's something that works, I would totally agree to have an actual debate with you where we prepare lengthy speeches and where we counter each other. Is that something that you would like to do?
Let's see how the reaction to this goes.
Sure.
And if people think that it's useful to have a debate.
Sure, but as said, I'm just making this distinction. If we want to have a debate, I would love to do that, and then we can lengthily bring up your evidence and your reasons and your supporting evidence and this and that. But this is just not part of that. I mean, we are.
I'm not saying.
I'm trying to logically argue for or against things here.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing as well, and that's part of conversation. I came to this discussion thinking that I'm going to have to defend very controversial issues, right? So if you want to defend something, you bring reasons, and reasons involve evidence. That's not just for debates, that's in conversation as well. I've actually been not in that many formal debates. So, okay, slavery, you want to talk about slavery? There's a very interesting quote from this anthropologist named David Graeber. He wrote a book called Debt, a 5,000-year history. But he's an accomplished anthropologist. Anyway, he says that if we brought someone like Aristotle, or we brought someone from the past to modern society, that figure from the past would think that most people in society are in fact slaves. Okay? They're actually in fact slaves, because our understanding of what is slavery, when we use that word, we think about chattel slavery, we think about 12 years a slave, things like this, these kinds of images of racial chattel slavery. And this is actually not historically universal. That's in America's history of transatlantic slavery. But most slavery in history did not look like that. In fact, every civilization, without exception, practiced slavery and slave labor within history. including Europe and so forth, with feudalism and transatlantic slavery, as I mentioned. So when it came to pre-modern societies, if one side defeats another side, you have two countries in a war, then what do you do with the losers? What does the losing side do? You either slaughter them or you enslave them. You can't just let them go and return, because they're going to be angry, they're going to reproduce, get stronger, and then come and pose a threat, an existential threat.
I agree.
Okay, so that's something that had to be the case in pre-modern societies, and their slavery was the slavery of Islam was not racially based. It was based on prisoners of war. In fact, Islam limited the avenues of entrance into slavery, and Islam was very good at integrating these conquered people into Muslim society, where the slave class ended up becoming very powerful and very knowledgeable, educated Muslims within overall Muslim society, because the Islamic state, Islamic law was not based on race, it was based on belief, as we discussed already. So, but the liberal mind has a problem with this idea of owning a person, right? Would you say that's the case? Because at the end of the day, okay, Islam treated slaves great and nice. That doesn't address the fundamental moral problem with slavery, according to the liberal mind. According to the liberal mind, ownership. It doesn't matter if the slave is living the life, an opulent life, but as long as he's owned, that is the problem. And the response to that is, historically, slave labor was the dominant form of labor. Wage labor was actually relatively rare. And there was a debate historically around the time of the Industrial Revolution in American history, where wage labor was increasing. And there was a debate on whether slave labor and wage labor are really distinct. Is there really a fundamental difference between wage labor and slave labor? And the argument that people would use is that slavery, is there a difference between owning someone versus renting someone? And this is a conceptual debate that they had, and many non-Muslim Western thinkers, liberal thinkers, argued that no, renting someone is worse, because think about the difference between owning a car and renting a car. When you rent a car, you drive it, in a very abusive kind of way, as opposed to owning it, where that's your investment, you care about it. Anyway, so that's something that's uncomfortable for people who are raised in the West, but this is actually a reality, and this conceptually, this idea of renting a person versus owning a person there was no distinction between it. If you were a wage laborer historically, you might as well have been a slave. It's the same thing. It was the same thing within all of these societies. Even feudalism. Is feudalism really different from slavery? Even though you're given wages and you're given a portioned, a certain livelihood, is that really different from slavery? No, it's a basic concept. So the concepts, the legal concepts underlying slavery exist within the employer-employee contract of wage labor, and it's a cultural difference. In many cultures, there's not really a difference between saying that person A, like Ridvan, owns George. Okay, that's a slave relationship. Ridvan owns George. There's not really a difference between that and saying that George has a contractual obligation to Ridvan. Okay, because they both imply force. If you're contractually obligated to someone, that implies force. Because if you don't pay up and you don't meet the contract, then you're liable to be punished by the law or punished by Ridvan. And Ridvan can extract that debt from you by force. And if you don't pay up, he can prosecute you. The sheriff can come and can execute you. So there's inherent violence in all contractual agreements, and this is something that leftist and communist thinkers were arguing in the 20th century, because they wanted to say that capitalism is essentially coercive. Capitalism is no different than slavery, and so you have this entire communist, leftist, Marxist tradition of arguing that capitalism is really fundamentally no different than slavery. So these are things that we can analyze and talk about at great length, but these are some of the ideas that we should pursue in our hunger for truth.
The problem is, Daniel, I really just let you speak because I wanted to demonstrate something, and I don't mean any offense, but I think you have talked for about 6 or 7 minutes about slavery, and I really just asked the question because I wanted to get to a single point, which was about how you can define the concept of slavery from the perspective of a slave, how you can combine that with the concept of essential or eventual human happiness. But we went into a great conversation on the history and logic of slavery, whereas I completely agree that slavery is an essential part of human history. For example, you would think that I will come with one of those with one of these typical imbecile objections, and will think, oh, slavery is evil. How dare people enslave people in history? How dare the Confederates do this and Muhammad do this and do that? No, I don't think like that at all. I think that slavery is completely historically, logically justified. I would indeed, that is what you said about how slavery was necessary, because if there are two societies, two towns, or two tribes, and they fight and have a victory over the other, what essentially needs to be done is, because in old times, in past times, these two societies basically their entire purpose is to rival and to defeat each other, to be superior over each other, to subjugate the other, because that's how society worked back then. It was completely normal, completely logical to enslave the defeated side, because if you don't enslave them, if you just let them go and take their stuff, they will eventually come back and take your stuff from you and probably enslave you or massacre you. That's completely within a historical perspective, that's completely reasonable. I completely agree with that. I completely think that slavery is an undeniable, necessary part of our human past. And although that might sound offensive to some people, that is simply true. I do think, however, that slavery was over the last centuries, it was extended into the centuries when it was completely unnecessary. The point, however, is it doesn't really matter whether slavery should have continued or shouldn't have continued, because the whole question would have come down to how can you combine the idea that slavery is okay in Islam with the idea that Islam strives for eventual human happiness, when Islam wouldn't have abolished slavery in today's time, and Islam would still continue slavery in today's time if it wasn't for international human rights laws and forces and laws pushed by the West. Slavery didn't end in the Islamic world because the Islamic world decided that it's no longer useful. Slavery ended in the Islamic world because the Islamic world was forced by the liberal West to end slavery in order to continue, in order to be part of the United Nations, in order to be part of basic interactions, of basic trade, of basic international laws. And when you look at the concept of slavery, you say that you might say that slavery in the Islamic sense is not equal to slavery in some other cultures, because you are not free to beat a slave, or to brutally beat a slave, or to kill a slave, or to several other atrocities against slaves, and you are supposed to take care of the rights of slaves. It is an undeniable fact that on a free Muslim's choice. A Muslim can choose to free a slave, but a Muslim can also choose not to free a slave, and can choose to buy and acquire as many slaves as a Muslim wants through war or through the slave market. This includes labor slaves and slave girls, with which a Muslim can have non-consensual sex with, for example. This has existed throughout society. Now, you could argue that this is somehow similar to the modern system, where people have to work their behinds off in order to have a proper living in the West, and that this is somehow comparable to slavery. But that is absurd. That is ridiculous, because when you're thinking about a slave who is completely dependent on the mercy of his owner. A slave has no choice in freeing himself, except if he doesn't want to convert to Islam. If he doesn't want to convert to Islam, for example, he has no choice in freeing himself. In some cases, he can make a contract with his owner and say, hey, I want to work off my price and free myself. And it is at the owner's discretion, according to some scholars, and the owner should should listen to the slave according to other scholars and then make a contract and free the slave. But in many cases throughout history in Islamic society, we have seen that slaves went on as slaves for generations. Slaves gave birth to slaves, who gave birth to slaves, who gave birth to slaves, and so on. You cannot possibly compare that to a Western system, to a Western capitalist system, for example, in which a person works for years, but can also do with his own life whatever he wants. He can choose a job, choose this job, choose that job, be self-employed, go to a different country and choose a job there, and go on lengthy vacations, have their own home, have whatever home they want, have whatever rights they want, and be completely equal in front of the law. It is simply utilitarian, I'm going to use that word again, that a society which has free individuals and no slavery is ultimately much happier, much more progressive, much more productive, as we see in the West. We have made much more production and much more progress than Islamic societies have made in 500 years. Than it is to have a system of slaves.
Right there. So you appeal to the productiveness. You appeal to the productiveness of the West.
Of course, I did because it's useful. It's good.
I took 5 minutes to morally defend slavery. You're taking 10 minutes just to tell people what many of your non-Muslim audience already feels and has been taught for years. How is that fair? How is that fair? I'm going contrary to the status quo and trying to argue. You spend 10 minutes just repeating the same points that everyone already... It's not like you're just reading back people's biases to them. Like, that's not very interesting. We get it, yeah. According to the liberal mind, slavery bad. Yes, we know. We know.
See. I will let the audience decide what to think.
Well, let me respond to that. Let me respond to the points that you made.
The entire point of this was to point out that I asked you a basic question and you went on to a whole 5-6 minute summary of.
Yeah, you're talking 10 minutes now. 10 minutes.
Irrelevant. Whereas my whole.
It was completely irrelevant. You asked me about slavery. I responded about slavery, and that was irrelevant. How does that make sense, man?
Was about the last minute of my talk, which was how do you compare a system where you are subject to a free human's mercy, and the Quran clearly says we have we have chosen some over others, and that the slavery and the human are not equal. The Quran itself justifies that logic. How can you say that an Islamic society with slaves is more for eventual human happiness than a Western society, for example, where someone can choose where they want to work and can do with their lives whatever they want? That was the entire point of the question.
So the one thing the whole point that I was making is that there isn't a fundamental difference conceptually and legally between the logic of being a wage worker and being a slave. Okay, that was the whole point of what I was saying, and I cited David Graeber, or I can cite other anthropologists and historians, and these leftist thinkers in the 90s. So these leftist, let me finish. The leftist theorists and the communists were arguing that, look, there's not much. Fine, you can choose between working at McDonald's or working at Burger King. Okay, this is the reality of choice for the majority of human beings living in the West. They are wage laborers. And they work hard. Some of them have to work multiple minimum wage jobs, working 80 hours a week just to be able to live, just to be able to survive. This is a reality based on what we see in the world today, and that's wage labor. It's very different than slave labor, because the slave is part of the household of the Muslim.
Listen, studies in order
to make an argument. Yeah, I should be like you and not cite anything and just talk off the top of my head. This is knowledge about the topic at hand. Why are you objecting to me citing evidence? Listen to the point. Muslims.
The question is very simple. You don't need to cite an argument to figure out whether you will be happy going to a school or you will be happy living in
no, you said that there's a. I'm getting to the answer to the question. I'm getting to the answer. No, how?
In a one-room house or in a five-room.
Look, I gave you the reality of happiness in the West. The institutionalization from birth until death. That's the happiness, and it involves slavery by another name. Yes, it involves slavery in our present. The difference between Muslim society. I'm answering it. I'm answering your question. You're portraying the West as this utopia.
I have a very simple question. do you think society is happier with individuals? Don't get into how you can define slavery. Do you think logically, and everyone can agree, can participate in this discussion and in this question, do you think a society is happier when numerous people in that society are enslaved and have no control over their own freedom, their travel, their means, their house, and anything at all, and are not equal in front of the law? Or a society in which people work hard, but can eventually choose their own jobs, make their own careers, and go wherever the hell they want? Which society do you think is happier?
I'm saying the
Simple
distinction that you're making is incoherent.
It's a simple question.
It's
Which society is
incoherent.
happier?
The distinction that what you're appealing to as the free society, the utopia that everyone can choose what they want to do, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in the West. It doesn't exist anymore.
Everywhere. You're speaking like one of those incoherent movies, or like 1984, or like what are those whole books called that were written in the first half of the 20th century. That's how you're speaking. I'm asking a very simple question: which society is better? Which society is happier?
Ridwan, which society is better? A society
not
that
better,
has
not better.
everyone is a
I
billionaire?
misspoke.
A society where everyone is a billionaire and lives in a
misspoke.
mansion? Is that
Happier.
society better, or a society that doesn't have that?
I misspoke. I'm not saying happier. Which society is happier? I'm not saying better. I'm saying happier. Which society is happier? Very simple question. You don't need to cite anything for that.
So slavery, okay? Which society is better, right?
No,
I'm asking you an analogous question because the question is framed in a problematic way. You're using terms without reflecting on the meaning of the terms that
I'm
are
asking you a
used.
very simple question. Why don't you just answer the question? Which society is ultimately happier?
A society that doesn't have any hierarchy is what you're appealing to. A society where everyone is equal at the same level. This is the argument from Robert Nozick.
I haven't said that.
Huh?
I haven't said that. I
Right.
haven't made that point.
So do all societies have hierarchy? Is that inevitable?
They have hierarchies, of course.
Is
That wasn't
a
the question.
society with hierarchy better or happier, or a society without hierarchy? Which one's happier?
It depends. That wasn't the question. That's a completely different discussion.
Okay, you can say it depends, but I can't say it depends. Why can't you answer a simple question, Ridwan?
What?
Answer a simple
What
question.
question? Because
Is
that's
a
whole
is a
different
society
discussion.
is a
That's not
society
what
with hierarchy better or happier, or without hierarchy? Which society is happier?
I would say some hierarchies are necessary, which answers the
Thank you.
question.
Okay,
But
that
that's
answers
not
my
the
question as well. Some
not
societies
the
with
question.
hierarchy are better as well. Yeah.
That is not the question.
So that means
is
some
like me
people are
asking-
under others. Hierarchy, for those who don't know what hierarchy means
No,
some
that-
people are below others. Some people are higher and some people are below. You just said that societies inevitably will have hierarchy.
Of course, but that's not slavery. This is like me asking, hey, do you think it's okay to be a slave? And then you say, well, you are a slave to computer games, which you find good. So what's the problem with that? This is the exact same thing. You're playing with words that have no relation to the topic at hand at all.
No, I'm
asking
taking
you
a
very
word
simple
that
question,
a word
which
that
you
you
refuse to
use,
answer.
a word that you're using, and that many use in a very unreflective, uneducated way. And I'm trying to bring some nuance and erudition to the concept. And I hope that your audience is interested in that. I think that I don't know if you have an educated audience. My audience is interested in facts and argumentation and reason. Muslims,
I doubt that.
Muslims are interested in reason and argumentation. So
Well, they don't really follow it. They're not the greatest example of that in the world.
I think they can judge based on this broadcast.
Okay, sure. So we haven't answered the simple question: which society is happier? The society that have.
You didn't answer it either. You didn't answer a simple question.
I did answer. It's like answering the question: do you think it's better to be a slave, or do you think it's better to be free? And then saying, well, I think it's okay to be a slave to computer games. That's basically what you
No,
did.
that's not what I said.
You cannot
Slavery
compare
slavery is a fundamental component of every society.
I'm asking you a very
Just like
simple question.
hierarchy is a fundamental component of every society.
Okay,
The
fine,
fundamental
fine,
structure of slavery is found in our society and is experienced by the lowest classes of people. That exists, and it's much more dystopian in the current modern world than it was. Slaves in Muslim world were much better treated and had a much higher quality of life and were much happier than the average poor employee living in the slums of any of these modern nation states.
I concede. I agree that Western nations have a system, have a hierarchy, and I agree that you could possibly define people who work very hard as slaves if you so want to. I am asking the question again, do you think a society in which slavery, where people are completely dependent on the mercy of their masters and their owners, where they have to do what their owners say and they don't have the freedom to live their life as they wish, that society and a Western society, for example,
no, that's not the case in a Western society. Your question, the way you're framing it is not meaningful.
Okay, forget about Western society. A society where people have to work very hard to make a living, but where they can also freely choose their jobs and move to places, buy their own homes, go up and down in ladders, pursue a different education, choose jobs and homes, and go to different and move to different countries. Which society is happier?
That exists in Islamic society as well. You're creating a false dichotomy. You're creating a false dichotomy.
I didn't even give an example for that example. I'm just asking you a question. Which example is about a society?
You said the Western. You said Western, didn't you?
No, I just said I'm not saying the Western. I said it first, but I'm saying now I don't mean the West. I don't mean West. I'm just giving you an example. This society and that society. Which society is happier? Which society will
the society that doesn't have if people's quality of life is increased by what you mentioned, then yes, that's a happier society, but it's something that is fantasy.
Okay, fantastic. So the point has remained unanswered after 20 minutes or 10 minutes. Fantastic. At least I'm happy to know that Muslims are after truth.
No, I thought it was interesting that you said that slavery is justified historically. I was actually surprised that you said that. So, because most people will bring up, well, the Prophet Muhammad had slaves.
I'm honest. I don't know how much you have followed, but I'm saying everything as it is about Islam. I'm not here to lie. The truth is as problematic as it's.
But one thing can we talk about this one point where you said that you mentioned the quality of life in the West and the progress that the West has made, and that shows how people are happier in the West today than they are in other places in the world. And you had said earlier that this is because of values, Western values, liberal values. Why is it the case that you have many countries in the world, such as in Eastern Europe, in South America, in parts of Africa, that have adopted these values? Because they're not Muslim, these are non-Muslim countries, but they suffer from poverty, from economic depression, despite the fact that they have these values of liberalism, freedom, and equality. How do you explain that? If it's just values, that results in progress and advancement, then what else?
I wouldn't think it's just values that do that. I would think values are a big part of that, and considering that Western society was built on these values. Although when Western society has pursued those values with the interruption of the Christian dominance and the Catholic Church, which was eventually opposed and defeated by the Reforms, by Protestantism, and eventually by the Enlightenment. Western society has been built on these values and has existed with these values for 2,000 years.
2,000 years?
Of course, I would argue that Western society has come to the point that it has been successful.
I thought you were an atheist, not a Christian. You think the values of the West originated with Christianity 2,000 years ago?
No. I'm speaking of when we speak of Western values in history and in society, we're speaking of the Greek and the Roman origins of society. Western society was not unique in that. Western society was not one entity. Western society spread as an empire and forced other Western geographically Western societies to change and to adopt the Western values, which we nowadays call Western values. We base these Western values on old Greek philosophical ideas, on values of the Roman Empire, on later Christianity, and finally on Enlightenment values. This is what Western values are about. You could consider Christianity as part of that or not. I would personally say that Christianity is a part of that, but that Christianity is also, you don't have to credit Christianity for it, but it is part of it, yeah.
So then what about these other Christian countries, like I said, who have also been Christian for centuries, and they have had access to the Enlightenment values, but they are suffering economically. They haven't, in 100 years, over 100 years of having constitutions and democracies and freedom of speech and all of these values, they're still suffering and they haven't developed.
Which countries? Give me an example.
Look at any country in Eastern Europe. Look at Ukraine. Look at even, some would say, any country in South America, Central America.
Eastern European countries are not entirely based on Western values, which is why we don't group them. When we group cultural groups, we don't group them as the West. We group them as East or Eastern Europe. That's because they were partially separated, both at the beginning and also especially after the adoption of Christianity. These two cultures were separated by the schism of Christianity between West and East, and Western cultures, such as all the Central European cultures, Western European cultures, have stayed loyal, have been built upon much more on the ideas of old Greek philosophy and than the Roman Empire than the Eastern part. The Eastern part has grown for at least 500 years separately than the Western.
How about Greece itself? How about Greece, the economically depressed country of Greece?
Greece itself.
Is that not based on ancient Greek values?
Greece has reached its independence from the imperialist Islamic Empire, which suppressed it only 100 years ago. How can you compare that?
100 years ago? So yeah. I'm just trying to understand, like, where these values that are so magical, that bring progress and development. So many of these countries that I'm bringing you as an example, and you always have an excuse like, oh, it was Orthodox Christianity doesn't lead to success and progress that's found in Eastern Europe. Only Catholicism and Protestantism is Western values. No,
that's
but
not the West. The West is the West. The West is not the East. The West is the West.
Yeah. So why? What's the success of the West based on? And you're saying that it's